seriously popular.
Welcome to the trial podcast, The Inquiry. I'm Caroline Cheetham.
And I'm Liz Hull.
We'll be back in a second.
Decisions.
Wait a minute. Are you still looking for cars on Carvana?
Yeah, decisions.
When I used Carvana, I found the exact car I was looking for in minutes. Bought it on the spot.
Electric or full diesel? Decisions.
Come on, you've been at it for weeks. Just buy it already.
You're right. Crossover it is. Decisions decided.
Whether you know exactly what you want or like to take your time, buy your car the convenient way with Carvana.
70,000 people are here, and Bob Dylan is the reason for it.
Inspired by the true story.
If anyone is going to hold your attention on stage, you have to kind of be a freak.
Are you a freak?
Hope so.
And starring Timothée Chalamet as Bob Dylan. He defied everyone.
Turn it down!
Play loud!
To change everything.
Make some noise, BD.
Timothée Chalamet, Edward Norton, Elle Fanning, Monica Barbaro. A complete unknown. Only in theaters Christmas Day. Rated R. Under 17, not admitted without parent.
I make it absolutely clear that it's not for me as chair of this public
The decision
inquiry.
to move Letby to day shifts raises serious questions which we will be investigating. Was there a cover-up? If so, why?
I would pray for God to save her. He did. He saved her.
The convictions stand.
But the devil found her.
In August 2023, a neonatal nurse called Lucy Letby was convicted of killing and harming 13 babies in her care. She was sentenced to 14 life terms and declared one of the country's most prolific serial killers. A year later, she was convicted of attempting to kill another baby and given another life sentence.
All this happened in the Countess of Chester Hospital over the course of a year from 2015 to 2016. But what went wrong? Who knew what and when? How was a nurse able to kill and hurt babies on a ward under the noses of her colleagues?
The Thirlwall inquiry is now underway in Liverpool and will attempt to answer these questions and more. We'll be there covering events every day. So a slightly quieter week this week as the inquiry starts to wind down for its Christmas break. Last week, you might remember, we brought you the evidence of the assistant coroner, and that was a man called Alan Moore. Now, he said categorically that he wasn't aware of the consultant's concerns about Lucy Letby. And this week, we've got the evidence of the senior coroner, Nicholas Rheinberg, who basically said the same thing. And he was really critical of the managers at the hospital, who he says kept him in the dark about the spike in the deaths and about Lucy Letby. And just in case you're not keeping up, that directly contradicts what Ian Harvey, the medical director, told the inquiry a couple of weeks ago. Today, as well as hearing from Nicholas Rheinberg, we'll also hear from the former health ombudsman, who shines a bit of a light on why scandals like Mid-Staffs and Morecambe Bay, and this one at the Countess, keep on happening in the NHS.
Welcome to episode 18, The Magic Circle.
Yeah, so Liz, essentially this week, there have been two key witnesses, and we're going to focus a lot of today's episode on what they've had to say. And that's because one of the witnesses was a bit critical of the entire inquiry system and whether it actually works. And the other was critical of the lack of communication from both the managers and actually the doctors at the Countess of Chester. So this man was the coroner for Cheshire, Nicholas Rheinberg, as we said at the beginning, and his evidence has been interesting, not least, actually, because it didn't really align with what the inquiry has already been told by Ian Harvey. Now, you'll remember Mr. Rheinberg's assistant, the man called Alan Moore, and he'd said that he and Mr. Rheinberg had a meeting with the hospital medical director, Mr. Harvey, and Stephen Cross, the head of corporate and legal affairs, in February 2017. Now, the inquiry was told that Mr. Harvey went away from that meeting and told the consultants that he'd discussed their concerns about Lucy Letby with the coroner in an open and transparent way. But Mr. Moore had disputed this. He insisted there was no mention whatsoever of her or any suggestion any nurse could be to blame.
Yeah, so Mr. Rheinberg was also asked about what he remembered about that key meeting. He said he recalled it because it was unusual for him to get a delegation of senior hospital managers coming to his office. And so just to anchor us in time here, this is at the point when the consultants have been told that Lucy Letby has been cleared of any wrongdoing and that she'd be coming back onto the ward. Now, we know that they didn't want this to happen because they didn't think the external reviews by the Royal College and by Dr. Jane Horden had ruled out foul play. So they'd asked Mr. Harvey and Mr. Cross to escalate it, if you like, to get the coroner involved and to ask him to review the cluster of baby deaths instead.
Yeah, so the managers went to meet Mr. Rheinberg, but as Mr. Moore told us last week, he informed Mr. Harvey and Mr. Cross that coroners don't actually have any legal authority to carry out the review that the consultants wanted. But again, like Mr. Moore, Mr. Rheinberg said there was no mention of Lucy Letby or any suggestion at all that the deaths were due to deliberate harm. So he was asked at the inquiry by Peter Skelton, he's one of the barristers for the families, about what he thought about the fact that he'd been kept in the dark.
It's horribly disappointing. We should approach all these tragedies not just in our own ivory towers, that we should share all information, because we might individually have pieces of the picture to put together. So police, hospital, everybody that has anything to add should add to the discussion, as I say, to complete a full picture of what has happened.
He said he had a close relationship with Cheshire Police, and if he'd known about the consultants' fears, he would have called an inspector in the force, who he knew well, immediately.
I used to go, I probably was regarded as a bit of a pain, but I would go to the police with any suggestion of criminality. As I'm sure you can imagine, a coroner's office in an area as large as Cheshire gets a fair amount of crank email correspondence, block capitals, underlined, green ink sort of style. Some of these will relate to totally irrelevant matters. Some will allege criminality, no matter how extraordinary or however unlikely or however it may be almost crystal clear that the person in question is mentally ill. All such communication was sent to the police for investigation with the instruction that I was to be informed as to the result of that investigation. So there would be no case of me withholding information such as that from the police. It didn't mean that it had my endorsement. It didn't mean that I was saying somebody was guilty of a crime. I was just asking in each case, please investigate.
He admitted he'd been given a bundle of documents by Mr. Harvey and Mr. Cross at the meeting, which included the Royal College review. But crucially, he only received a version which had been redacted, so the section about Lucy Letby was missing.
Yeah, and the inquiry has been told that even though the deaths of all 7 children murdered by Lucy Letby were reported to Mr. Rheinberg immediately after they died by the paediatricians on duty, only baby A had an inquest. The cases of baby D, baby O and baby P were being considered for inquest, but the police were called in before they could take place, and the deaths of the other 3 babies, that was baby C, baby E and baby I, were wrongly thought to have natural or medical explanations. So Mr. Skelton asked Mr. Rheinberg what he remembered about baby A's inquest. Now, we know that baby A died in June 2015, but his inquest didn't take place until October 2016. And by this point, of course, many more babies had died or collapsed. And specifically, Mr. Skelton wanted to know what Mr. Rheinberg thought about the fact that neither Dr. Ravi Jairam or Dr. Murthy Saladi told him about their concerns.
Dr. Dryman was in fact suspicious of Lucy Letby at that time, and also suspected that she may have injected air into one or more children, and was suspicious about child A's death in particular. He has accepted he should have mentioned that suspicion to you. Can I ask for your reaction to that?
Yes, absolute horror. Why not? Why wouldn't you? I think in those, so if that had come out at the inquest, I would have adjourned, wouldn't have gone on any further, and probably sought police involvement.
Likewise, in respect, presumably, of Dr. Saladi, although his role at the inquest was much more minor, but he was aware of the suspicions and indeed shared them as well.
Yes, it does seem extraordinary.
We should point out here that Dr. Jairam has already told the inquiry he should have told the coroner, but he didn't have the courage to mention it at the time. He also said he thought Mr. Rheinberg already knew about the spike in deaths, and that he'd tried to throw him some breadcrumbs in the hope he would pick up on what was going on without him needing to spell it out. Now, no cause of death was identified for baby A during his inquest, and Mr. Rheinberg admitted it was a disappointment because it didn't provide the answers for his parents.
From my own point of view, I was not happy with the inquest. It didn't really achieve very much. It brought the legal process to an end, but without any solid answers. And sadly, that can be the case, that the evidence just isn't there. It can't be found. But it was a disappointment that nothing really very solid emerged from that inquest.
In this case, I was asking you specifically about the fact that the hospital were aware of things that related to child A's death, but that was never brought to the family's attention via the inquest process.
No, to put it mildly, that is extraordinarily disappointing.
And in fact, Mr. Rheinberg said that even after the inquest, no one from the hospital told him about the link to Lucy Letby or brought to his attention the consultant's suspicions about what was going on.
Can I be clear that at no time did Mr. Harvey or Mr. Cross or anyone else raise the concerns directly in terms with you and discuss them with you?
No.
We'll take a break there.
Hey, it's Emma Chamberlain. I designed these new glasses for Warby Parker, and I basically can't take them off. Like, I'm showering in them and sleeping in them. They're just that good. Go see them all at warbyparker.com. And you know what? Have a good day too. Okay? All right? Bye.
Americans are durable. We take pride in hard work and high quality. American Giant makes durable, quality clothing right here in the USA. Because what we wear reflects who we are. When you buy American Giant, you're not just wearing the best clothes money can buy. You're helping keep jobs and pride in your own backyard. Premium clothing built to last decades, like it should. Get 20% off your first order at american-giant.com with code RightHere24.
So another interesting witness this week who talked a lot about the behaviour of senior managers and clinicians in the NHS was Sir Rob Behrens. Now, he's a former Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, and he spoke a bit about how certain people in senior positions at hospitals who fail to listen to their staff and to the families of patients are undermining patient safety and trust in the NHS in general.
So just a bit of background before we get into what he said. Sir Rob explained that the Parliamentary Ombudsman is responsible for investigating around 1,000 complaints about the health service every year. But he said the system in the UK is complex, and actually few people understand exactly how it works, which means sometimes very serious issues never reach the Ombudsman's door. In fact, he said no complaints about neonatal deaths or services at the Countess of Chester were made to him in 2015 and 2016. But he did have a lot to say in general about the way NHS scandals are investigated and why, despite successive public inquiries like the one we're covering, Caroline, and those that happened at Midstaffs, Morecambe Bay, East Kent, the infected blood scandal, the list goes on really, the same problems keep reoccurring and the NHS never seems to learn.
Yeah, he did say that. And he also said the problem is that families of patients have to fight when things go wrong. They have to fight the hospital and the hospital's legal teams and then the government for a public inquiry to take place. But he also said the system of deciding what constitutes a public inquiry is flawed. And more importantly, he said there's no body to make sure the recommendations made by them are put in place when they report their findings. Now, this is also something you remember we discussed with Elkan Abrahamsson a few weeks ago, and it's something he's also campaigning for, that public inquiries have to matter and their recommendations need to be taken on board. Now, what Sir Rob also said was there's a worrying acceptance that this is how things are in the NHS and that we'd all got a bit too used to seeing repeated failings. And just to illustrate the point, he gave the example of the maternity scandals at Morecambe Bay and at East Kent, which were both investigated by a man called Dr. Bill Kirkup.
So he wrote at the end of his inquiry into East Kent that there's no point in me making detailed recommendations because what I proposed before has not been adopted. The same issues are relevant as they were 10 years ago. The failure of teamwork amongst clinicians, the failure to listen to patients and their families, the failure to investigate appropriately, and the failure of the board to be interested in what's going on. Now, that is very worrying, but it's a cultural issue and it needs to be addressed. And you do need political leadership to do that.
He said there's still a culture among NHS leaders of blaming doctors and nurses when things go wrong and not enough focus on learning and development. And he said there's also a lack of transparency and empathy in dealing with complaints from patients and their families. Now, that's certainly something that's already been a big feature in this inquiry. Families being kept in the dark, details being withheld from the coroner, and parents having to find out about investigations in the press, and in some cases not even being told that their children are involved for months and even years after they died or were harmed.
What people in difficulty want is to know that people respect the situation that they're in and can identify with it and have empathy with it. And this has not been a strong point for the National Health Service. In all of the reports that we've had, the lack of empathy shown to people in great difficulty is a key issue because it discourages people from feeling that they're being listened to. And again and again in the case of Scott Morrish, who lost his son to sepsis age 3, Merope Mills, who lost her daughter, and we now have Martha's Law as far as that's concerned. James Titcombe. So many people that I've met, they have said, people have not treated me in an empathetic way to encourage me to believe that my case, my complaint is being dealt with seriously. And too often, people feel that they're not listened to and they're not really at the heart of those people who are looking at what they're complaining about.
We're actually hoping to chat to James Titcombe in the new year. He lost his son Joshua after hospital failings and has become a campaigner to stop what happened to him happening to others. But what Sir Rob was very clear about was that the culture in an organisation is led from the top. And too often doctors and nurses are too afraid to disclose or whistleblow issues of patient safety for fear of how it would be received by managers, and in extreme cases that they could end up losing their jobs.
The whistleblowing law does not work in England. And too often, in my experience, doctors who want to disclose patient safety issues are disciplined or threatened with discipline by the leadership of the trust and the board. And this means that they are extremely vulnerable when they do blow the whistle. And I have had, as the Ombudsman, considerable number of telephone calls from clinicians who have rung me and have said, we want to raise a patient safety issue, but if we do, that will be the end of our careers. And that is not a good way to address patient safety issues. And there needs to be a reform of the law, not only on whistleblowing, but on the duty of candour, to make sure this doesn't continue to happen.
And we know, of course, that at the Countess, both Dr. Jairam and Dr. Stephen Breary felt that they were victimised by Tony Chambers and by Ian Harvey, who threatened to report them to the General Medical Council when they blew the whistle on Lucy Letby. And the inquiry has also been hearing that their concerns were never treated as whistleblowing, which meant they weren't afforded those protections that they should have got under the NHS's Speak Out Safely policy. And Sir Rob said the duty of candour needed to be replaced with stronger powers because what he called puny fines were no deterrent for leaders who too often were more interested in preserving the reputation of their organisation rather than dealing with patient safety issues. Now, both Mr. Chambers and Mr. Harvey denied that this was what they were doing when they gave evidence a couple of weeks ago.
Time and time again, we've seen through behaviour that senior managers and boards are more interested in preserving the reputation of their organisation than dealing with patient safety issues. And this must have something to do with the culture of the leaders of the health service, and it must have something to do with the absence of a competence framework in which these people operate. And that goes really to the heart of what's wrong about the leadership of the NHS. And historically, and this is not a party political point, there has been insufficient emphasis on patient safety, despite the large number of things that have been done on the patient safety front, to make leaders convinced that they have to put that first.
He described what he called the magic circle of senior leaders within the NHS, who are allowed to move from hospital to hospital, even if they're deemed to have underperformed or failed. And Tony Chambers gave us a frankly quite astonishing insight into how chief execs in particular are helped to move around in the NHS when things go wrong. He said it happened all the time, and he even said it had a nickname, the Donkey Sanctuary. In his case, we know that when the paediatricians told the board they wanted to hold a secret vote of no confidence in his leadership, an organisation called NHS Improvement came in and told him they'd help him into a new role if he agreed to step aside. He did resign before any vote could take place and went on to hold more senior posts at other NHS hospitals, including one on a bigger salary than he was paid at the Countess.
I think one of the difficulties that I've witnessed is that there is an element of the magic circle about leaders in the NHS. If you look at the leadership in trusts, then people tend to go from one to the other, and it's more difficult for new people to come in. And that magic circle is not healthy. But where there's no competency framework and where you can't take notice of the failure of people in their previous jobs, then I think it becomes self-limiting and too narrow.
Now, we know one of the things that Lady Justice Thirlwall is looking at is how accountability for hospital bosses can be strengthened. And actually last month, Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, announced consultation on new regulation, including a professional body that could potentially ban individuals from holding the top jobs if they are found guilty of misconduct. Now, that's much in the same way that doctors and nurses can be struck off if they're found to have made serious mistakes by the General Medical Council or by the Nursing and Midwifery Council. Now, actually, just to go back to the point that Sir Rob makes, a recommendation that this type of regulatory body for NHS managers be established and set up was actually first made more than 20 years ago, following the inquiry into the baby heart surgery scandal at Bristol Royal Infirmary. So the fact that it still doesn't exist really goes to his point that there should be an organisation that oversees recommendations made by public inquiries to ensure that the government acts and actually puts them into place.
There is no body at the moment, as far as I know, which is the watchdog of the reports and implementation strategies of public inquiries. But that should be something that a prestigious public body should have responsibility for. For example, the National Audit Office. Why would it not have oversight of looking at what has been implemented and what has not been implemented?
And also, he said political leadership was needed to change the culture in the NHS and the way scandals are investigated.
And I think there's a real problem, if I may say so, with the way in which we commission public inquiries at the moment. They are ad hoc, they're political, they're not understood. And it leads to injustice and failure in patient safety in a way which is distressing for the people who have suffered.
So that's it for today, and actually for this year. The inquiry are now having a bit of a break for Christmas, which means they're back in the new year, and we will be back then as well. In the meantime, you can catch up on any previous episodes or listen to the other trials in our series wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks as ever for listening and for sending us your comments and for giving us your reviews.
You can follow us at The Trial Pod on Instagram and on TikTok at Daily Mail Crime.
And do keep leaving those comments on Spotify or send us a voice note on WhatsApp on 07796 657 512. Start your message with the word trial.
See you soon and a very happy Christmas.